Hey everybody, welcome in. I'm just going to give everybody a couple seconds to go ahead and settle their video and audio preferences. Because this is a meeting, we highly recommend that you guys keep your mics on mute unless you're speaking, but we're so excited to have you guys here. So we'll just give it about another minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome in. Okay, so we look pretty good. On behalf of AACRAO, I just want to welcome everybody and thank you guys so much for joining us for the Transfer and Articulation Community of Practice Forum. We are in a Zoom meeting, so for those of you guys who haven't joined us before, again, with the tech preferences, we ask that you guys keep your mics off unless you're speaking, but we do encourage you to have your cameras on at your own comfort level to feel like we're actually in a meeting. It can be kind of strange. We've been over Zoom for the past 2 years. So it's always nice to see face to face, but again, at your own comfort level. Another thing that I wanted to disclose is that this meeting is being recorded to be posted later. So it's something else to keep in mind when choosing those preferences. But we will go ahead and get started. I want to introduce our moderator, Mark Booker. He's joining us from the University of Phoenix. Mark, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to pass the mic to you.
All right, thank you so much, Christina, and good afternoon to everyone. I think with the time zone changes right now, we're all afternoon. Sometimes of the year, it's actually still my morning sometimes, but good afternoon to everyone. Glad you could join us for this bi-monthly edition of our Transfer and Articulation Community of Practice Forum. So for those of you that are newer or who may not have attended this meeting before, just kind of to let you know what this session is and why we're here. The Transfer and Articulation Committee for AACRAO decided to look at getting engaged with all of you as membership a little bit more in depth. And as part of that, we came up with the idea of having a community of practice forum every other month. And largely it's because with the result of the pandemic, as well as more demand on student mobility, we felt creating a community time for us to talk about transfer credit, to go over common topics or things top of mind would be a great place to do that. So the goals of this forum are just to create a shared space where our whole AACRAO community can come together and kind of create even some connections for phone a friend items. So as we talk about different topics, we know that we'll open it up to everyone on the floor to discuss some things. And in certain cases, if that applies to your institution, you now have someone else you can reach out to offline after the meeting. So we're super glad you're here today and appreciate you making time. Also, very appreciative for those who were going to attend. I think a couple of weeks ago, we generally try to have this on the fourth Friday every other month. This one was rescheduled slightly just due to scheduling conflicts and a few other things. So we're glad for those of you who could join us today who had tried to attend a couple of weeks ago. So the two items that we're going to go over today in kind of our facilitated session, which I'll discuss with you, are one, there was an update to the joint statement on the transfer and award of credit. And a few of the individuals that attend the session had said, what have been the changes on that? What changed? What's pertinent and important about the joint statement changes? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then another topic that has come up that people wanted to delve in a little bit more is the change in accreditation distinctions. And what has happened, and I'll go into a lot further detail, the Department of Education actually changed some of their guidance and rulings. So the concept of quote unquote regional accreditation no longer exists. The accrediting bodies do, but the concept no longer exists. And for a lot of people, that affects their transfer policies or how their transfer policies are written. So we want to talk a little bit about that. And then from the at the end of the session, we'll just leave it open for open discussion or open topics that people may want to talk shop on transfer credit. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, let's talk about the joint statement on the transfer and award of credit. Now, for those that may not know, the joint statement on the transfer and award of credit is a document that's lived for about 20 plus years. And it was signed by both the American Council on Education, AACRAO, and CHIA, the Council on Higher Education Accreditation. And it was a co-signed document that has been updated about 3 or 4 times. I want to say 4, but it could be just 3. And it was most recently updated in December of 2021. And what this document is, it's not a hard and fast policy document, but it is a document that provides guidance on how institutions should view transfer and set up transfer policies. And as those of you who have been in the transfer space for over 2 decades or longer, like myself, you will know that things have changed quite a bit over that amount of time. And that's why the document was updated again, because it's a living, breathing document. And so within this, and Melanie, who is now, Gottlieb, who is now the executive director of AACRAO, was one of the signatories on it. But the statement was updated because of things that happened with the pandemic and also with the rise in student mobility. Students especially are more apt to move around with more distance education and more other learning opportunities, as well as just easy to travel. And so within that, there has been changes even since the last time it was signed, which was about 2016. There have been a lot of changes that they wanted to encapsulate, including items around credit for prior learning. The other thing that happened, and it actually will go into our second topic, is the document was updated around some changes in accreditation distinctions. And again, we'll talk about the nuances of that in our second topic, but you'll see the joint statement, if you look at the 2016 version versus the 2021 version, it actually encapsulated some of the things that changed with that new Department of Education guidance on accreditation. And we'll get into that in detail in a second, as well as I go through what are items on the joint statement. The statement overall, though, still emphasizes the importance that while maximizing acceptance of credit is important, it is still an enterprise that institutions have autonomy over. And so within that, a couple of things on that. Schools still are encouraged to have their own policies, and their own policies can be unique and distinct and their own thing. Now, while states have a large say in some of that, especially if you're a public institution, at the end of the day, transfer and acceptance of transfer is still an academic enterprise on this process that you have autonomy and say over. But they are encouraging that for also equity issues, and I'll touch on that briefly, that the acceptance of credit be looked at as something, if you can accept credit and it makes sense for your institution, to please do so. That's kind of the overall overriding sentiment. And I'll stop for a second because Nancy has a question in the chat, and it's a good question, so I'll answer it now. Was there a conversation with CAEL on CPL? So CAEL was an entity that was consulted, I think, in the drafting of this, and they actually are mentioned, if you look into the new joint statement, they are mentioned for the first time on the joint statement on this. From a CPL standpoint, ACE also, who does the assessments for all the military credit, and they're very big in the CPL space, creates a lot of language around encouraging the acceptance of credit for prior learning, especially if it meets the same learning outcomes. So I think that they were consulted on it. They're not a signatory on it. The 3 bodies that have signed it since the beginning of its existence are the same 3 bodies, just the names changed. Actually, the individuals changed, but the organizations were the same. But CAEL is mentioned, and largely for those that don't know, and this is a good distinction, CAEL largely does a lot of credit for prior learning, especially from an individualized portfolio assessment, or what students can bring to the table from a learning outside of the classroom individualized perspective, whereas ACE looks and does a lot of assessments for standardized programs across the board, military credit, Oracle training, et cetera. So they're both big players in the CPL space. So great question. Thanks for that, Nancy. So the one thing that did not one thing, but one of the things that did not change with the joint statement was there are 3 fundamental factors that are still recommended when deciding to award transfer credit. And one is the educational quality of the required learning for which the student seeks credit. So first and foremost, which should be important to every institution, make sure that if you're accepting credit and awarding credit, that the quality of the acquired learning, and you'll see it says acquired learning, not courses, so it's even flexible to accept CPL, is of high quality and meets the standards for what your institution needs. The second item that still is a carry forward is the comparability of the content, scope, and rigor of the required learning to that offered by the receiving institution. So again, just the quality and the acceptance and the rigor of what the student did in the past, but you'll see it's still language that's at a high level that doesn't speak to course by course. It can be just whatever learning is as deemed by the institution. And then again, the appropriateness and applicability of the learning towards the program offered by the receiving institution in light of the student's educational goals. It's really, really important, especially if you're doing CPL type items, but any credit acceptance items, that you have an understanding of what that learning was in the past and how it applies into the institution it's going into. So these three principles, when deciding to award credit from the joint statement, still apply and still carry forward. So I'm going to stop for a second if there's any questions on that before I get into some detailed items on the joint statement in and of itself. So I'll check the chat for a second and see if anything comes through. Okay, seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and get into the joint statement nuances that are a little bit different than the prior joint statement. So the prior joint statement actually was 4 pages and the new one is 3 pages. So it's actually a little more efficient. And one of the ways it became more efficient was some of the review on items or considerations institutions should make when building transfer policies. And again, the joint statement isn't a document that you have to follow from a hard and fast accreditation rule or department rule. It is really just a conglomeration of best practices, especially when creating different policies for your institution. And what I like to say about the joint statement in many cases is, if your institution is looking to redo your transfer policies or building a transfer policy as a new institution, it's a really good foundational guiding document to start from. So the first item that it talks about, and to the question on CPL, is the standard for evaluating and awarding CPL should be the same. So one of these considerations especially is some institutions have looked at CPL and the rigors of assessment on whether to award credit may be different depending on the input of what the student brings in. So if a student brings in life experience versus something that's standardized training, they may make it more rigorous because of the type of input or the type of activity the student did. Now, what the joint statement recommends is, if you're doing CPL policies and you're doing an assessment, and the assessment outcome, regardless of the input, leads to the student having appropriate learning that would be comparable to the native institution to satisfy credits or learning, the kind of sense is, do a solid for the student and let that be accepted as CPL. Doesn't mean that you have to accept everything in CPL, but again, if you're having a process and you're doing an assessment, you probably should look at the outcome of the student. And if the outcome is the same, regardless of the input, it is encouraged that you probably should land on the side of awarding credit. And it just makes it easier and more equitable for the student. The second consideration is credit award decisions must be applied consistently and equitably for all students and be standardized. So this is pretty much kind of a table stakes issue for a lot of institutions, but really when you look at transfer credit, and if student A and student B bring in the same courses into a similar program or program area, it should be equitably awarded for the students, and also the process should be standardized. So there shouldn't be a student that gets a wildly different return on a transcript of taking courses from a similar institution in a similar state. And that may seem like, kind of a no-brainer, if you will, but when you look back at how things have evolved in the transfer space over the last 20 plus years, there were times where in certain cases, the process of transfer credit would be beholden on the evaluation of an individual and their own judgment call. And that judgment call would be different from a peer who was looking at a transcript right next to them. And so the standardization and doing that is important, especially if there are process and protocols. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be credits where judgment calls are existing, especially when faculty review it. But if there is, you want to try to make sure everything is as standardized and equitable as possible, given the input on the students' prior transfer credits. The next consideration that the joint statement recommends is policies should aim to maximize the amount of credit applied to fulfill requirements toward completion of the student's credential. And this is something that you see get stronger through the different years of the joint statement. The idea of the fact that we should maximize the amount of credit that students have from prior institutions when and where we can. And the reason that that is super important is because as students are putting in so much money of their time and effort in learning, and then may change institutions, if you don't accept or apply credit, sometimes that can be a detractor from the student completing their ultimate goal, which is a degree or a credit-bearing certificate. And that gums up the system actually for us in higher education overall, and for those who are looking at higher education policies, value, et cetera. Now, again, this is the aim to maximize the amount of credit. It is not a requirement to always accept every credit for any reason that's out there, but we do want to try to be looking at as institutions, especially of higher education, and that have a goal of teaching and learning our students, if it makes sense and the learning is appropriate, let's again do students a solid, given the huge rising costs of education and some other of the items that are in our industry today, especially with student debt. So Brittany, I see your question. Will the slides be sent to everyone? If you want, I can, and my email address will be at the end of the session. I can send it out to you. This recording will be on the AACRAO site, but for anyone who wants a copy of this set of slides, I can send it out to you. And then Sheila, let me look at her question right now. We have some courses that have direct transfer based on major. For example, one course might come as one thing if the student is a nursing major, but for all other majors, it transfers into something else. Does anyone else follow that protocol? So I'll let some people answer in the chat on this, but I'll also answer from a high level perspective, but because you put it out to the whole audience, I'll let other people add in the chat. A lot of cases, when you have major specific or core courses, depending on your nomenclature at your institution, yes, credits may transfer into that specific, if you're, in your case, nursing, may go towards the nursing major requirement. But if a student is in a different program, let's assume they're in a business program, for whatever reason they decided to be a nurse and go into business, typically a lot of institutions will roll that into elective areas, or depending on the content of the nursing course, could roll it into general education science courses, because again, it's nursing related. So that's how I see many institutions across higher ed handle it. There are institutions that don't have obviously wildly different policies, but generally kind of the best way to do it, if the student has open electives, or again, because you said the discipline was nursing, if there's a general education area that it makes sense because of the amount of science in the course to put it in a gen ed spot, or a liberal arts spot, maybe that could be permissible. So I'll let other people add in on their other thoughts on other schools, but that's just kind of the general higher ed perspective at large. So. Okay, so then the next item is policies and practices must be reasonable, transparent, and easily understood. It is very, very important that your catalog really spells out to what students can expect on transfer credit. A lot of institutions have actually started looking at creating transfer pre-evals or other things like that, so students understand what they may be getting from a transfer perspective. If you look at catalogs from 20 plus years ago, sometimes the transfer credit policies weren't really easy to understand. It was kind of looking at a different language. And so it's just really important that with increased student mobility, understanding how the transfer policies practices work is important. And that's another item in the joint statement. This is one that is actually a very, it's actually interesting. It's a recommendation, and now it's actually something that is a hot button item on Capitol Hill. But institutions should remove obstacles from preventing students from accessing transcripts in order to further educational studies. I don't know for those that have been following some of the negotiated rulemaking or other things in the higher ed world, but the idea of students not being able to send transcripts to other institutions or for jobs because of and I'll call them minimal fees, has been a big topic. And so many institutions are actually waiving, a lot of institutions in the past have had a provision where if you owe fees, we're not going to send transcripts out, as a way to get the student to pay a fee, which is a practice that has existed widely, but because of different things in the economy and in the marketplace, if a student is furthering their studies, there's encouragement to not have students be held up for fees, especially if they're library or parking fees, et cetera. The reason I bring it up as a item in higher ed, there was a joint statement by AACRAO and NACUBO about this topic, and all that they're being asked for here is to have institutions be thoughtful on reasons that you would hold up a transcript for students, especially if they're going for a job or educational studies, and the sizing of the fee. There's a lot of different perspectives on this, but that's just kind of the joint statement kind of recommendation. And again, I would say it's not that you can't do it in all cases, it's just be thoughtful about why you're doing it and the amount of money owed versus the gain that will be there. Item 6, and we'll touch on this further when we talk about the accreditation item, but this is spelled out a little bit differently in this updated joint statement because of the changes by the Department of Ed. But accreditation should not be the sole determinant in whether to award credits or not, providing the and that's, I should have a comma there, providing the entity is recognized by CHIA or the U.S. Department of Education. And the interesting thing is remember I noted about this joint statement, CHIA is actually a signer on this. And so what CHIA is saying, if whether is accreditation in and of itself should not be the only filter on whether to award credits or not, because there's other bodies, whether they're recognized by CHIA or the U.S. Department of Education. And we'll talk about that accreditation thing in much further detail, so I'm not going to spend too much time this second, but that's one of the items that is recommended in the joint statement. And then on the flip side, they actually speak to accreditors on consideration 7, and that accreditors should be considerate to us not to create policies or practices that would minimize the acceptance of credit or diminish flexibility for an institution to accept credit from CPL, CBE, or other sources. So this time around, they actually started to put more emphasis again on CPL, but they also talk a little bit about CBE and competency-based education, because a lot of competency-based education programs may not have credits as we think of them normally, or their grades may not be the A, B, C, D, items like that. But what they're saying is if the student has learning that can fit and again be equal or greater than what your native learning is, we should have that acceptance. And for accreditors, they should be very cognizant of things that would limit that. There have been, again, I'm taking the long view of think the past 25 years, there have been times in the past where part of accreditation requirement and criteria, there would be limitations on the percentage one can transfer for CPL, CBE, et cetera. Those have been largely loosened, I believe, from all of what was formerly known as the regional accreditors, but there can still be things where we want to drive for innovation in the transfer credit space, again, as it meets all learning outcomes for an institution. But, try not to, as an accreditor per se, create policies that may limit the student's ability to flow or get recognized for prior learning if they transition schools. And then the last item is institutions are encouraged to leverage technology to improve transfer credit operations to become more efficient, consistent, and flexible. And so whether it's using NCE, the NSC, National Student Clearinghouse, parchment credentials, working with the Speedy Committee and AACRAO, all of those things that are out there that we could have other conversations about on a different day on protocols that allow technology to improve the transfer process and also make it more efficient and also quality, because sometimes with technology, it can point out some variations or differences in awards that can help you, tighten up student records and awards. Those are all things that are encouraged in this joint statement. So that is a really, really brief review of the joint statement and a lot of the things that are emphasized in this new document. And it is, again, foundational to setting up table stakes. As an institution, you always have your choice of doing what you want to do, but this is just kind of the sandbox or some of the barriers and borders that ACE, CHIA, and AACRAO all kind of recommend in the transfer space. So I'm going to stop for about 30 seconds, take a drink of water, and see if there's any questions about any of these topics I talked about before we move on into the accreditation item. Okay, so in looking at the questions, Amber has a good, interesting question. There's currently a standard that a lower 100, 200 level course, lower freshman, sophomore, sometimes considered, won't transfer to fill an upper junior, senior 300 and 400 level equivalency. Given the attempt to maximize credit applied, what are others doing in terms of 100 and 200 or lower division courses, particularly general education courses? Are other schools accepting 100 level class to transfer in as a 200 level equivalent if the description and objective is the same, or strictly just sticking to 100 to 100, 200 to 200, et cetera? So let me again talk about what I see at a broad basis, and some of our schools here may have different perspectives, and I invite them to put that in the chat, but I'll talk about what some schools are doing from a broad basis to make things transfer friendly. So when you look at, and we'll use 100, 200 level and 300 and 400 level to be the distinction of lower division versus upper division. So with lower division courses, 100 to 200 or upper division 300 to 400, many institutions are considering lower division as something that can come in. So if you have a 200 level, well, actually, let me take it this way. If you have a oral communications course that is at the 100 level, and there's a requirement at any institution for oral communications at the 200 level, they will let that flow through and they won't have any resistance to that. So that's a broad basis because it's considered the lower division area of a degree. The upper division areas of a degree get a little bit different as far as the upper division areas. Now, what I do start to see in institutions is, let's assume an institution has created an upper division, we'll call it business fundamentals course, and a student, and it's let's call it business 330. And the student has taken a business fundamentals course at a relevant community college, and it's a business 220 course as far as introduction to business. If the content and the objectives are very similar from a content perspective, what they may do is one of two things. One, make an exception to allow that course to apply and satisfy the need for a student to take business fundamentals over again, but still require the student to somehow, some way, make up upper division credits elsewhere, because what that will do is cause a shift over into the need of the distribution between how many upper division versus lower division credits you need. So I'm going to talk in very vague generalities. Let's assume the student has a 120 credit degree, needs 60 lower division credits and 60 upper division credits. What they would do is they would say to the student now, well, you don't need to take business fundamentals anymore, but you still need to take 60 upper division credits. And if that creates a gap, they'll allow that upper division course to satisfy an elective area because you shifted where the course applies. Not all SISs can handle this thing, but on a manual audit perspective by hand, it can work. And I've seen colleges do that. If in case there are those 60, and I'll use the 120 credit degree, 60-60 split again, and I know this is semester credits. What I've also seen some schools say is our general policy is you need 60 upper division, 60 lower division. However, I'm going to make an exception this time, and now the split will be 57-63. So the student will complete 57 upper division credits and 63 lower division credits. I see that sometimes with articulation partners within state when there's community colleges going to a state institution. And the reason being is that there's kind of a general consensus that, upper division part of the degree needs to be, 45-ish plus credits, or in certain cases, it can be lower than that. But, they'll kind of go, it's not a huge deal. We'll make an exception, and the exception gets documented. So that's kind of how the lower towards upper division gets handled from what I've seen for schools that are trying to be transfer friendly. They'll take it on a case by case, and they'll try to work something out for the student as to not minimize or not have them repeat content that seems to be the same. And I see a lot of gymnastics with audits on that for articulation partners, or they'll just tell the student to take a different upper division course when they get there, and they'll satisfy the upper division content need with a lower division course, but not the upper division credit requirement with that. So hopefully that makes sense for those on the call. I know it's a complex question and kind of gets different. And it also depends on how your institution just feels about upper division, lower division splits. and the standards and rigors of what your faculty are teaching in certain areas. So I don't know if that helped, Amber, but hopefully it did. And then I see Sheila put in some things in there, and she's on the 3,000, 4,000 credit calendar basis, so, or the course ID basis. So, all right, moving on. If there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But let's talk about accreditation categorization changes. So this is something that I find as I've talked to different individuals in our sector and our area of industry that they may not actually be aware of in certain cases or know that this changed. And it was very subtle in how it happened. Although there were some news stories in Inside Higher Ed in the Chronicle that talked about it, but it kind of happened and then it kind of went away. And so what occurred was there was a negotiated rules making session in 2019 that basically started, and it was kind of bundled. I'm going to be very clear on this. It was bundled in a lot of other different areas of the negotiated rulemaking, where it basically said that from an accreditation purpose, that the idea of regional accreditors only needing to operate within the region doesn't need to exist anymore. And in fact, there should just be institutional accreditors. So that would mean, and I'm giving you an example, WASC, who generally has done, kind of the West Coast, California type area, would then be able to, upon this change, be able to accredit institutions in Florida if they felt like it, or other things like that. They would just have to follow that process. And institutions in Florida or New York or whatever could move outside of their region if they wanted to get a accreditor to accredit them from an institutional standpoint. And so what ended up happening is that was put into the Federal Register. It was published, went through its open comment period. And in July 1 of 2020, there was no longer a formal designation for Department of Education purposes on the idea of a regional accreditor. There was just institutional accreditors. And what that meant also is, and this is where it impacts transfer, what that meant is that now your what we call nationally accredited institutions were on the same list as what we used to call regional accredited institutions, because the department felt, here are the list of institutional accreditors, they're one and the same. In their mind, we approve them for Title IV purposes if a student wants to access aid. So there's just institutional accreditors. And again, there's a lot of other nuances that I won't go into here, but the two things that are important as it comes to a transfer credit perspective are the ideas of, first, the department has one list of institutional accreditors. There's not a distinction between regional or national from a department perspective. And it also means that what we knew as the regional accreditors now could accredit institutions with headquarters outside of what their prior region was. So now within that changes a few things, because typically as a institution who is in a certain region in the past, you could kind of rely and depend upon that policies would be similar for those who are in your region. Well, now if other accrediting or other regional accreditors can accredit other institutions outside of their region, policies may start to vary and deviate a little bit. So that's one thing to know. But the other thing is the fact that many institutions wrote their transfer credit policies to read such as, we will accept credits from a regionally accredited institution with a grade of XYZ or better, that are, transferable categorizations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the goal with that historically was to preclude nationally accrediting bodies. And for those that may have questions about what the prior difference between regional and national accreditation was, or what the goals and foundations are, I can answer that question. Just put it in the chat and I'll get to that if that's something that this group needs. But with those distinctions gone, if you have a policy now in your catalog that says we only accept credits from regional bodies, that is actually incorrect at this point. And that's why we bring it up, and that's why we want to talk about it here, because you kind of need to massage that language and change it, because it doesn't necessarily exist the way it did prior to this date. And again, it's a nuanced item, not something that everyone caught, but it exists from that end. And what you start to see is a few things. a lot of the previously, again, regional accreditors are calling themselves institutional accreditors. In certain cases, they will refer to themselves as regional accreditors for the sake of historical purposes. They'll say, we were one of the 6 original regional accreditors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they'll do nods to that. So it's not completely expunged from their websites, but they'll nod to that fact. But for Department of Education purposes, they're not classified as such any longer. The interesting thing too is CHIA's website also still refers to regional accreditation, but again, you won't really find this on the current version of the Department of Ed website. And again, many of the accreditors are referring to the idea of being regional in a past tense, because now they theoretically can go wherever they're outside of a specific region. And so a few things with that as well is that when you had that as a criteria, as again, the distinction between we'll accept credits from regionally accredited institutions versus nationally accredited institutions, you'll have to update and revise that. And the world has become more nuanced with the implementation of this change. So the question then becomes, how do you word that in your policy? Well, I want to give a couple of guidance items, which is up to your institution to determine how you want to do that as guidance from things. So one is some schools have started to say, we recognize the accrediting bodies that are listed on CHIA's website, because a lot of the accrediting bodies that were recognized by CHIA were regional, but just know that CHIA actually, and they still separate things into regional on their website, they actually have a list of accreditors that are programmatic on that website. They have a list of accreditors especially that I think TRACS, which is a theology previously nationally accredited body, is on their website. So if you do CHIA, it's probably going to change the output and the outcomes of what you had previously said too. And I think a few institutions that I talked to about this topic had said, we're just going to go with CHIA's list. And the only thing with CHIA's list is longer and more robust than, again, what the 6 or 7 regional accreditors were in the past. And I say 6 or 7, depending on WASC had some splits, and that's a whole other story for a different day. So that being said, you have to think about how you want to do this. Now, the one thing I'll bring your attention back to is the fact that, remember, one of the things that both CHIA, AACRAO, and CALE said is, you probably shouldn't have accreditation be the sole determinant on whether you're accepting credits. Now, accreditation is really important as probably a criteria, but it shouldn't be the sole criteria. But accreditation is something that is used to determine, obviously, quality assurance and learning from a prior body. And so when you look at that, I've seen other schools looking at this problem and going, I'm just going to straight out list the bodies I want to accept credits from. If it's the 6 regionals, I'm going to list out the regionals' names, et cetera. It makes it more complicated than just saying regional, but it gets you back to a same place where you were before. But I do want to caution, and this is not for me to tell an institution what to do. I just want to caution a few things. If you do make that the hard gate requirement for transfer, and again, it shouldn't be the only gate, just know that in the past, and transfer credit is becoming more and more a thought and concept around equity. Some of the nationally accredited institutions, while some were spurious, and I won't argue that, some were good at what they were doing, and some students, because of access, that was the only place they could go to, especially if you're serving working adult students. So you may want to be very nuanced and considerate on students who bring nationally accredited credits in, or what was previously nationally accredited credits, to see if there's a mechanism for you to accept that, because especially if you are starting to serve more and more working adult students, and if you look at the historical trail of things, there could be issues with equity should you make that, again, a hard and fast rule that will not accept anyone or any credits that came from a national body that were in a degree-related program. It's a consideration to make. I think the conversation about that will get louder as time goes on, but just know that. So I'm going to stop there because it's a very seemingly small change for what the department did in their mind, that has large implications from the transfer world. And so I will do my best of my ability to answer questions on this, and I'll stop talking and take a drink of water and see what we have.
What did you need to know? we actually are set. We've had to delay a person.
Any questions on this or things that you need at your campuses around this? Okay, Audrey, has any attendees changed policy language? Can you share how you stated this? I'll leave that to any attendees that want to say anything while I have the attendees either come off mute to say what they want or share. Our institution where I'm at, we have listed the bodies in the past, but we have typically been with working adults a lot of times, so we have mechanisms to accept nationally accredited credits. So the regional only wasn't a consideration at our institution, but there are different paradigms if the student came what was from an institution that was previously nationally accredited as far as learning for either direct transfer or for CPL purposes. So. Allie went with the CHIA recognized institutions verbiage. So, and again, that's a great solution. Just make sure you check the lists because you may be accepting more than you did the day before. Anyone else on this one?
Hey, Mark, it's Allie.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who would like for their institution to start taking non-CHIA transfer credit, but you get pushback? I do think it's definitely an important access issue. But I think that there are, people that think it could be a quality issue. But I do think it's important to talk about and think about taking that non-CHIA transfer credit. How would you go about beginning that conversation?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to understand, and I'll use the older nomenclature of the nationally accredited institutions. There was a wide range of bodies and also the type of credentials that nationally accredited institutions fell under, from degree granting to vocational only non-credit activity. And what I would start at is a couple of things for those institutions that are curious about accepting credit in this space. The first is taking a look at what institutions were actually degree granting and courses that were degree granting at those institutions, because typically if you look at the accrediting bodies language for on the national accreditors, the degree granting requirements were much more strict and stringent to be a degree granting approved institution than a vocational institution. So there's a point there. And what I've seen institutions do is if it was a student enrolled in a degree program for credit towards a degree program, they'll give more flexibility to that student to do what I'll call a direct transfer without going through CPL processes versus not. Outside of that, if there is just confusion or concern, what I would do is I would look at a process for those who would be leery of accepting credits because of, and there were some bodies, again, that I won't get into fully here, it's a different conversation, that were not doing their job probably as well as they could. And if you want to evaluate some of those items, create a CPL process for that, which would mean that your evaluators are taking a look at the outcomes, the credit, kind of doing a deep dive, look at the hours allocated in the syllabi for the courses to ensure that they had the appropriate equivalence that you'd want as far as learning for academic credit at a semester or quarter basis on those type of things in that realm. And then the other thing is as you do degree builds or at the degree at your institution, if there's a chance, for example, a student needs elective credits, it may be a good, and they're deficient, it may be a good opportunity to say, we'll accept this for elective because it's an open bucket and it was learning, and we feel the learning was appropriate enough to be at an academic level. We just think we'd prefer you to take content at our institution from a directive like true liberal art gen ed or major perspective. We don't want to do that. Some institutions do that in that realm. So they'll say, we want to make sure that we're helping you move forward to degree completion if you have deficiencies, but also we're taking a really, really hard look at the content. And then I always recommend A/B testing if there's faculty at an institution. If you're interested in doing this, you can always accept, as an institution, you make an exception, make the exception on the credit for the student, and then watch the retention outcomes of those students versus the native students. And if you do that and get enough data at that point, where you're again doing a solid for the student and they're proceeding well, then that gives you the opportunity to expand the conversation of maybe changing your policies. But I think again, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that especially with more and more students, especially at older ages that have some college credit but no credential, unfortunately, from 70s, 80s, 90s, where we're getting students from in certain cases, there were some equity and access issues, and we just have to be cognizant of that. So, and Sheila shared some items, and so did share some items. And Allie, does that answer your question? Is that a good starting ground? So.
It does. Thanks, Mark.
Okay. All right. Anything else on this specific topic? And again, this was a topic that our membership actually asked us to talk about because some people may not have been aware, and their catalogs are saying regional, which actually, and this is the last thing I will say on this, theoretically, if you have the word, we only accept regional only, and you're not pointing it out to other definitional items or what was previously the 6 regional, et cetera, someone who would want to be, I'm just going to say it, a little bit ornery in regards to the transfer process could say there's no such thing as a regional accreditor. I want you to accept my credits. So just know that with that nomenclature changing, I've seen a lot of policies be disputed in a lot of ways. So we wanted to put that out there so people were aware of it. So, all right. So we are now at the point where if there are any other topics that anyone wants to talk about, I'm glad to either have people open their phone lines and throw out a question related to transfer with the time we have left, or anything else. And if there are none, I'll give it a minute or so to see if there's any questions about other transfer topics, and then we'll talk about next steps if I don't hear anything. So time is open. So either put in the chat or come off mute and ask a question you may have.
Oh, while we're here, Mark, if anybody has any ideas for future sessions, put those in the chat as well. Our committee would love to hear them.
Yes, Allie, absolutely on that end. And future session we're going to have is actually going to go over articulation agreements. And Allie, what was the other one we talked about? I know we have.
We were going to talk about how to operationalize like large
yes.
transfer teams.
High volume transfer credit. So. Miguel says some international transfer credits as a new topic. Yeah, we can definitely look at adding that in. That would be a good one. And Carrie asked for more transfer updates. Yes, we'll continue to keep everyone informed. VA. Thank you for that one too, Carrie.
Oh, while I just thought about it, Mark, what are your thoughts on what's going on in Florida with SACs and Florida institutions having to find new accreditor?
Actually, I'm not well read on that one just yet, so I'll have to look into that one on that piece. So. But that's something we can definitely share. ACE online institutions from Carrie, okay. Thanks so much for your suggestions. All right. Well, one last chance for anyone who has any other transfer related questions or wanting to ask anyone else who's attending anything, how they're doing it. And if not, we can end a few minutes early and give you 10 minutes back, but I'll give it about 30 more seconds. And if not, then we'll call it a session.
And just to hop on one more time, I just want to take a minute to thank you again, Mark, for joining us. And on behalf of AACRAO, thank you to all of our attendees for your participation and perspectives. I hope that you guys were able to connect a little bit more and share ideas. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of the week, or it's now the weekend, and we'll give everybody maybe 30 more seconds to get a last word in, and we'll go ahead and shut it out. Thanks again.
Okay, thanks again, everybody. Have a great weekend and appreciate you attending. And again, we'll do this session in June. So thanks so much and take care, and we'll talk soon.